Praying in school and praying at football games in public schools in particular can be a treacherous area for anyone. It can be even more so for coaches. I've seen this pendulum swing in different directions over my 49 years. This week, I'm going to tell you a few stories about prayer and football, and as usual, I'll throw in a little advice for young coaches. When I got involved playing in the 1960s, prayer was part of Friday night football. Players prayed, often coaches prayed, and ministers prayed over the loudspeaker at the stadium before every game. The same was true when I first started coaching in the 1970s. Every team I can remember being involved with said the Lord's Prayer prior to the game. Back in the day, coaches often led the prayer. Anyone who played back then can remember coaches who led a prayer and then followed it with a string of profanity as they sent us onto the field to do battle with God firmly on our side. We often had ministers speak to the team, and I was involved with some teams that actually had chaplains. Nobody thought much about that in the South until about the 1990s. And they certainly didn't think about it in rural areas. There weren't a lot of non-Christians in those rural areas in the South back in those days. Or at least, people said they were Christian. They might just be backsliders and such. Catholics were a rarity. There were a few Jewish people here and there, but Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists were pretty much unheard of in those days. So, as long as you stayed to a fairly generic prayer, nobody cared much. Sure, you had the occasional fire and brimstone guy whose prayer before the game would remind us all we were going to hell without Jesus. But those guys were rare. As there were more and more incidents of coaches getting into trouble over praying with players, I eventually adopted a practice of leaving that entirely up to them. I would tell the captains at a certain point in every pregame that they had the team to take care of anything that needed to be taken care of before I came in to give them their pregame talk before entering the field. If the team wanted to pray, that's when they did it. It was written in on the pregame schedule. Team time. I was nowhere around, and whatever they did was voluntary on their part. I was intent on following what the courts ruled. Now, as I moved from rural South Carolina to more urban North Carolina around 2000, instead of coaching players who were pretty much exclusively Christians, I encountered much more diversity of religion. I did not believe it was right to force players into participating in something that was not what they believed religiously. Nor did I feel like it was right to exclude them from team activities. Y'all, I hope I don't get my podcast banned. Here I am talking about diversity and inclusion and such. Anyway, as I've told younger coaches that I mentored along the way, things connected to religion and coaching are still connected to winning. Now, what I mean by that is that if you cursed, as long as you didn't direct it at the players, you were okay as long as you won. But if you ever saw that record slip in terms of wins and losses, the first thing they're going to use against you is going to be the profanity. They don't want to admit to firing a coach over wins and losses, or even more often, firing a coach because Johnny's influential parents aren't happy. But profanity will get the job done. So be careful. I'll never forget the time I was called into the principal's office for using the word crap in the classroom, as in, I'm not going to put up with this crap. 40 years later, I still don't get that one. Somebody really didn't like me. The other extreme also gets you into trouble. I've seen coaches told not to lead prayer, and particularly not to talk about religion to the team. Now, when I was an assistant coach at Apex High School after moving to North Carolina in 2000, I worked for a great coach, Bob Wolf. Coach Wolf is a devout Christian, and he's as good a man as I've ever met. If he had a fault, it was that he was too nice. He believed he could save them all. Now, not in the biblical sense, but just that he could fix their problems no matter how far gone they were. Now, from time to time, Coach Wolf would throw in some references to Jesus, and he would pray, and he might quote some Bible verses every now and then. Inevitably, he was told to tone it down. He was also told at one time to tell his assistants to tone down the profanity. You see, Coach Wolf himself, he never said anything stronger than ass. You know, like, let's go out there and beat their ass. But I'll never forget Sunday meeting when he told us there had been complaints to the principal about language and that we needed to do better. Greg Thomas, one of my best friends, had a vocabulary that extended into novel uses of certain phrases that would not be acceptable in church. So when Bob told him we had to tone it down, he looked at Bob and said, "Shit, Bob, what the fuck do you expect me to do?" Now, I've also seen really successful coach get into hot water because he was taking kids to get baptized. He didn't lose his job, but as I said, he was very successful. Had he been losing, there might have been a different outcome. I have known coaches who were overly religious who did not keep their jobs. They weren't winning. For many years, at more than one school, we had the Fellowship of Christian Athletes come in and have an inspirational or devotional period with the players. They bring in a motivational speaker, sometimes a former pro or college player, to talk to the team. They would, of course, throw some religion in there. Our practice in terms of this was simple. We posted the game day schedule for all pregame activities. The FCA was listed on the schedule. Players were told at the beginning of the year that the FCA would come on Fridays, but attendance was optional. I never attended. Assistant coaches could do as they pleased. I just needed at least one to be in the meeting for supervision. Now, just a little side note, in case somebody is listening who wants to be a head coach someday, pay attention to that word I just used, supervision. That will get you fired. That will get you sued. Not supervision itself, but the lack of supervision. You must make sure that every player is supervised from the time they become yours every day until they leave the campus. You must know from your principal at what point in the day they become yours. If the bell rings at 2:30, practice begins at 4. When are they under your supervision? You better have somewhere for them to go and you better have somebody watching them. Like a teacher, you don't leave them unattended. At the end of practice, someone on your staff stays at school until the last one catches a ride. If something happens to a kid that you left at school on his own, it's on you. If one of them does something stupid at 3:30 in the afternoon, it's on you. If there's a fight in the locker room, and at some point in your career, there will be a fight in your locker room, you better have a coach either inside or outside of that locker room to break up the fight. So, enough warnings to prospective coaches. Let's get back to prayer. As I mentioned earlier, prayer in the stadium over the loudspeaker was the norm. But prior to the start of the season in the early 90s, as athletic director and head football coach at McBee High School, I received a letter from the school district lawyer informing me that prayers in the stadium were no longer to be conducted, as this was against rulings by the Supreme Court. And there had obviously been issues at some other schools for us to get a letter. You see, all the ADs in the district got the same letter. My job had always been to arrange for a local minister to pray prior to every football game. Or if none was available, find someone else in the community to do it. Following the instructions from the attorney, I did not arrange for a minister to be at the opening game that season. There was no prayer that night. Monday morning, there was a note in my box from the principal. See me. You never wanted a see me note. So I went to see him first thing. Why wasn't there a prayer on Friday night? He said. My phone has been ringing off the hook all weekend. Come Monday morning, there was a note in my box from the principal. See me. You never wanted a see me note. So I went to see him first thing. Why the hell wasn't there a pregame prayer Friday night? He said. My phone has been ringing off the hook all weekend. For the uninformed, this is not a good thing. Having your principal getting phone calls on his weekend about something you did or did not do. I told him about the letter and I was following instructions. He told me, go get the letter right now. I did. When I brought it back, he read it and then said, I'll be keeping this. To hell with him. You work for me. Have somebody up there praying every Friday night. I'm not having these people on my back over this. If he doesn't like it, he can take it up with me. And so every Friday night after that, somebody was up there praying prior to the game. Which brings me to a couple of my favorite pregame prayers. The first was a player's prayer. I was an assistant coach at Apex, and the JV players were in the locker room prior to the game, taking turns saying their piece. We had a little small coach's office at Apex that sat between the varsity and JV locker rooms. It was so small the entire staff couldn't fit in there. There was a small shower in there, over on the side in the corner. If you sat too close to it, you'd get wet. Sitting there on a Thursday afternoon prior to the JV game, I could hear all of what they were doing and all of what they were saying in the JV locker room next door. You can actually learn a lot about teams and players from what they're saying and doing in the locker room before a game. You get a real idea about who your leaders are, for example. At one point, one of the more religious players decided to pray. He had a fairly involved prayer that included a number of things I was pretty sure he had just heard a minister or deacon say in his church, but he himself didn't really understand. There was proof of that when he concluded the prayer and he had me rolling on the floor in the small office next door as he prayed, Lord, we pray that ye shall smite our enemies tonight. I was fairly certain he was taking things a little bit too far and that God was not smiting anyone over a JV football game. Now, the other memorable prayer was at North Central High School. Now, North Central at the time was literally in the middle of nowhere. You see, a few years before that, they had 4 small schools that the district wanted to consolidate. Those 4 schools had been rivals for years and years, and they all hated each other. This is not going to be one of those things where they built a new school where any of the existing schools were located. Nope, nobody was going to stand for that. So they decided they would actually find the center point between the 4 schools and build a new one right there. You had 4 small rural communities. I mean, very small. They built it between the 4, and so they built it where no community existed, in the middle of nowhere. Genius. Anyhow, the country preacher they had up there in the press box that night delivered the longest pregame prayer in the history of pregame prayers. He went on and on, blessing pretty much everyone he could think of. I thought at one point he was just going through the stands, picking out people he could see, and asking God's blessing on them as he went along. I actually had a minister on my staff at the time standing next to me, and he looked over and he says, he needs to just shut up so we can play. But after droning on and on, with the players getting more and more restless, and the coaches getting very restless as well, the local minister finally came to a rousing conclusion to his prayer. And Lord, may the team that scores the most points win this game tonight. We did score the most, and we did win. The power of prayer, y'all. Next week, I've got a couple of stories about coaching mistakes, including my own. And we'll talk about the infamous go home incident.